Okay, this is a recording on relative frequency histograms. Okay, a relative frequency histogram is very much similar to an ordinary frequency histogram. So in an ordinary frequency histogram, you have bars that span over a certain class that are right next to each other, and those bars represent a frequency. So this is the value, and this is the frequency. Okay, all we do with a relative frequency, so this is like how many have that value, right? All we do with a relative frequency histogram is we take away frequency here and we make it relative frequency. Okay, so now this is going to be a percentage. What percentage of the whole have the values in that class? So this is a larger percentage than this, and this is a smaller percentage, but it gives us an idea of the shape or the distribution of the data over its range, right? Okay, so the question is like, how do we make one of these using the TI-84 calculator? Now, admittedly, this is a very tedious kind of process, so I'm going to go through it step by step. I will not on a test ask you to create one of these because it is a little bit tedious. I may provide you with a relative frequency histogram and ask you to draw some conclusions from it, but I won't ask you to actually create one. Okay, so the best way to do this is to actually start with the data in a frequency distribution. Okay, so if you just have raw data, it's pretty easy to build like a tally table and then build that into a frequency distribution of a particular number of useful classes. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to provide you one here to work from. So this is one that we used a couple notes back. And the first thing you want to do is, if you see these scores on the left, what we do is we want to find the midpoint of each of those. And we're going to take out the IQ scores, and we're actually going to replace that with the midpoint. So like if you took 50 plus 69 and divided that by 2, you would get 59.5. This one would be 79.5. So we're going to take those out, and we're actually going to replace them with the class midpoints. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is actually build a table, or not a table, I'm going to build in the calculator a table using this information. Okay, so I'm going to drop into L1 all of the class midpoints, and then drop into L2 in the table the frequencies. So let me bring up the calculator and show you exactly what that looks like. So this is my TI-84 calculator, and I am now dropping in the data like I said I was going to. So I'm going to go Stat, Edit, and into L1 I'm going to put the 5 class midpoints. 59.5, 79.5, 99.5, 119.5, and 139.5. Okay, so I have those in there. And then I'm going to hop over to L2, and I'm going to put in the frequencies that I had. So my frequencies were 2, 33, 35, 7, and 1. So if you don't know where I'm getting these numbers from, it's okay. You can go look at the notes that are in the Google Classroom. That should get you there. Okay, so what I want to do is actually start to shape a histogram here. Now, I'm going to get a pretty ugly one at first because I'm going to let the calculator decide where things are, but I'm going to modify that using the window button. So let me get back to the home screen, go second mode, and then turn on the stat plot. So that's second y equals. I'm going to choose the first stat plot. I'm going to turn it on. I'm going to use a histogram, And the X list is in L1, so that's correct. And then for the frequency list, I'm going to use L2 because that's where I put my frequencies. Now, if I press zoom 9 like I did before, go back to the main screen, then press zoom 9 like I did before, it gives me a pretty ugly histogram. It doesn't seem to be pretty representative of the table that I had before. Well, I'm going to do some windowing here. If you look at your table, the lowest value of the lowest class was 50, so I should probably start my histogram at 50. That's my X min. The highest value of the highest class was around 149. I'm actually going to let it float up to 150. I could do it at 149. It would be fine. My classes from like one class to the next, it goes like 50, 70, 90. They're like 20 units apart, so I'm going to scale my X unit at 20. So just by doing that, if I hit the graph button, it makes the histogram that lines up with my frequency table. So like if I hit trace, you'll see that like the first class had 2 members, and then 33, and then 35, and then 7, and then 1. So that's a much more attractive histogram, but it's still a frequency histogram. It is not a relative frequency histogram. So relative frequencies you get by taking each frequency and dividing it by the sum of all the frequencies. So I'm actually going to let the calculator do that work for me. Kind of leverage it a little bit here. So if I go second mode, that takes me back to the main screen. Now, here's a little trick to calculating, right? So all of my frequencies are in list 2. So if I go second 2, that's list 2. I want to divide them all by the sum of all the frequencies in list 2. Now, how do I do that? Well, there's a bit of a trick here. If I go second stat, it gives me some options. I want to go to the math list, that if you look down here at number 5, there's a sum. It means like you add up all the things in the list. So I'm going to pick number 5. Okay, so I'm taking list 2, dividing it by the sum of everything that's in list 2. Okay, so that's list 2 divided by the sum. That will give me the relative frequencies as decimals. But I want them as percents. Okay, so I'm going to multiply that by 100. So I've got the relative frequencies as decimals, multiplying it by 100. And now, ultimately, I want to store that somewhere. And a good place to store this is going to be into list 3. Okay, so I hit this STO button down here. That gives me a little arrow that says, all right, store this. And if I go second 3, it says store it in list 3. I'm going to enter and it's going to do like some weird stuff. But if I go to stat edit and I look at list 3, it now has all of the relative frequencies. 2.5%, 42.3%. Okay, so how do I make the relative frequency histogram out of this? I just modify the histogram that I already have. Okay, so let's go back to the main screen, second mode, second y equals. I'm going to look at that first plot again. Now, I don't want the frequencies, which are in list 2, but I want the relative frequencies, which are now in list 3. So I go second 3, makes that list 3. Now, if I just hit graph, it's going to be a little off. It looks so close, okay? Like, everything looks good, but like if you look up here, these two are going like way off the top of the page. Now, if you remember, the 2 highest relative frequencies were like in the 40s. So I got to get above those. So if I window and I make my Y maximum instead of 40.95, I make it 50, that'll accommodate all those relative frequencies that were in like the 42% range. And then I hit graph again, boom, there it is. There's my nice, neat relative frequency histogram. And if I hit trace, it says like in the first class, it's like 2.56%. In the second class, it's 42.3%. In the third class, 44.87%. The fourth class, 8.9%. And that last class at the end is about 1.28% of the whole. So this is a fairly informative diagram. Now note, it has the exact same shape as the frequency diagram. The only thing that's changed here is the way that we're graduating the y-axis. Before, this represented frequencies. Now it represents relative frequencies. Now, mind you, I just showed you a pretty complicated problem. There's like step-by-steps of everything that I did here in the notes. But it is not likely that you will have to create a relative frequency histogram on your own for the next assessment. Okay, it's entirely possible that I would hand you like a drawing of a relative frequency histogram and maybe ask you some questions about it, but I'm not going to ask you to do this. But I wanted you to have this in your notes so that if you're like in a college stats class and you ever have to do it or something like that, you have kind of a step-by-step directions for how to get there. All right, so there you have it, relative frequency histograms.